Gray Penner sat in his favorite armchair, a novel resting on his lap, though his eyes skimmed the same line for the fifth time. He wasn't really reading. He was waiting. The faint rumble of an engine signaled Kelly's return, late again for the third night this week. When she walked through the door, Gray felt a pang of something he couldn't yet name. She was radiant, as always, her beauty undeniable, but her confidence had taken on a sharper edge, a confidence that wasn't for him anymore. Smudged lipstick, the faint scent of a man's aftershave, and a detached air had been slowly replacing the warmth they'd shared over the past 7 years. Tonight, Gray decided, was the night to confront the shadow creeping into their marriage. Gray Penner sat in his worn leather armchair, the kind that had molded to his shape over years of quiet evenings spent reading. The book in his hands, a detective novel he usually devoured in a day, now felt heavy and lifeless. He read the same line over and over, the words blurring as his thoughts wandered. His eyes kept darting toward the clock on the wall, its steady ticking amplifying the silence of the house. It was past midnight, and Kelly still wasn't home. This was the third time this week she had come home late. On Monday, it was a work emergency. Wednesday, a vague catching up with an old friend. Tonight, she hadn't offered an explanation at all. Gray had stopped asking, not because he didn't care, he cared too much, but because her answers always felt rehearsed, delivered with an ease that made him question his own instincts. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke his trance. He placed the book on the side table, careful not to make a sound. The engine idled for a moment before shutting off, and then there was the telltale click of her heels on the pavement. She hadn't worn those heels in months, he thought. They used to be her special occasion shoes, reserved for date nights or weddings. Now they seemed to be her go-to. The door creaked open, and Kelly stepped inside, bringing with her the faint chill of the autumn night. Gray's breath caught. She was stunning as always, her long hair framing her face like a dark halo. Her lipstick was slightly smudged, and a faint blush colored her cheeks. Not the kind that came from makeup, but from something more alive, more electric. She smelled different, too. Beneath the floral perfume he knew so well was another scent, musky, sharp, undeniably masculine. "Sorry I'm late," she said, her voice light but distant. She didn't meet his eyes as she slipped off her heels and set her purse on the counter. There was no explanation, no pretense of an excuse this time. Gray studied her carefully, his heart heavy with a mix of longing and dread. There was something new in the way she carried herself. She seemed taller, more self-assured, as if she'd stepped into a version of herself he didn't recognize. It wasn't just confidence, it was detachment. Kelly wasn't the same woman who used to curl up beside him on this very couch, laughing at reruns of their favorite sitcoms. But then, it wasn't just her demeanor that had changed. Gray had started noticing little things over the past 4 months, things that felt off but were hard to pin down, like how her phone was always face down on the counter now, or how her laughter sounded different when she talked on the phone, hushed but brighter. And then there were the clothes. New dresses, new shoes, even a new perfume she hadn't mentioned. When he'd asked her about it, she'd smiled and brushed it off, saying she just felt like a change. Sitting there, watching her move around the room, Gray felt a strange sense of displacement, as if he were a visitor in his own marriage. He wanted to believe there was a simple explanation for it all. Maybe it really was work. Maybe she was just rediscovering herself. But the signs were too glaring now, too persistent to ignore. He noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she poured herself a glass of water. She was trying to appear composed, but there was an edge to her movements that gave her away. It was in the way she avoided his gaze, the way she sipped her water too quickly, as though trying to fill the silence between them. Gray's chest tightened. He had always prided himself on knowing Kelly better than anyone else. He could tell when she was upset, even when she tried to hide it. He could finish her sentences, predict her moods, but now he felt as though he were staring at a stranger, a beautiful, enigmatic stranger who had built a wall between them, brick by careful brick. As she turned to leave the room, her figure illuminated briefly by the soft glow of the kitchen light, Gray clenched his fists. The distance between them felt insurmountable, but he wasn't ready to let it define them. Not yet. Gray had always thought of Kelly as his anchor, the one constant in a world that sometimes felt too chaotic to navigate alone. From the moment they met, there had been a quiet understanding between them, a bond that didn't need grand gestures or sweeping declarations. She was his sanctuary, the person who could ground him with a simple touch or a knowing glance. But now, as she moved about the house with an ease that felt almost performative, Gray couldn't shake the growing chasm between them. She was breathtaking tonight. The warm light from the kitchen cast a soft glow on her features, highlighting the angles of her face and the effortless elegance she carried. Even after 7 years, she still had the ability to take his breath away. But it was different now. Her beauty, once a source of comfort and pride, felt like a reminder of how far she'd drifted. Gray's thoughts spiraled as he sat there, unmoving, watching her sip from her glass. He remembered the way she used to light up when she walked through the door, her eyes searching for his as though he were the only thing that mattered. Now, her gaze seemed to skim past him, lingering instead on the middle distance, as though she were already somewhere else in her mind. It wasn't just the physical distance that hurt, it was the emotional one. He could still feel the ghost of her laughter, the way she used to tilt her head back and laugh from her core when he told a joke, no matter how corny it was. That laugh had been a lifeline for him, a reminder that he was enough. But lately, her laughter had been rare, and when it came, it felt hollow, like an echo of something that used to be. He replayed their recent interactions in his mind, searching for clues, for signs that he'd missed. Was it something he'd done? Something he hadn't done? He'd always believed in their partnership, in the idea that they could weather any storm together. But now, he wasn't sure if they were even in the same boat. His heart ached with the weight of his emotions, love, fear, anger, and confusion, all tangled into one unbearable knot. He loved Kelly with a depth that frightened him, but that love was no longer enough to silence the questions gnawing at him. Why was she pulling away? Who was she when she wasn't with him? And yet, even as suspicion crept in, there was a part of him that couldn't let go of hope. He wanted to believe that there was an explanation, a reason for her distance that didn't involve betrayal. Maybe she was going through something she didn't know how to share. Maybe he had failed to see her struggles, too caught up in his own routine to notice the signs. But then there were the other moments, the ones that tightened his chest and left him staring at the ceiling late into the night. The way she had started dressing up more, her outfits carefully curated, as though she were preparing for an audience that wasn't him. The way her phone was always close by, a password suddenly guarding the messages that used to be open between them. Gray felt like he was living in two worlds, one where his love for Kelly remained steadfast, and another where doubt chipped away at the foundation of everything they'd built. It was exhausting, this push and pull between wanting to trust her and fearing the truth. Still, even as the evidence mounted, a part of him couldn't bring himself to hate her. She was the woman he had vowed to spend his life with, the woman who had once made him feel like the luckiest man alive. And perhaps that was the cruelest part of all, the realization that he might still love her, even as the version of her he'd known was slipping away. Gray's hands tightened on the arms of his chair as he watched Kelly place her empty glass in the sink and head toward the stairs. She paused briefly, her silhouette framed by the dim light. For a moment, it looked as though she might turn back, might say something that would shatter the wall between them. But she didn't. As her footsteps faded, Gray was left alone with the heavy silence of the house and the storm raging in his chest. He knew he couldn't keep living in this limbo, caught between the woman he loved and the stranger she was becoming. Gray watched Kelly move through the kitchen, her motions fluid, almost too practiced. She hummed under her breath, an air of casual detachment wrapping around her as she put away her things. Each click of the cupboard doors, each flick of her wrist seemed like an eternity to Gray, each one pulling her further from him. Her distance wasn't just physical anymore, it was emotional. An invisible wall that had slowly risen between them over the past few months. The woman who had once shared every little detail of her day, who had held nothing back, now seemed almost foreign. It wasn't until she started up the stairs, her steps light but deliberate, that the frustration Gray had been bottling up suddenly burst free. The silence of the room became unbearable, pressing down on him like a weight too heavy to ignore. His chest tightened with a mixture of anger and fear, and before he knew it, his legs were moving of their own accord, carrying him toward her. "Kelly," he called out, his voice unsteady but firm. She froze at the bottom of the stairs, her body stiffening just slightly. She didn't turn around immediately. Her hand lingered on the banister, as though she were deciding whether or not to face him. The silence between them stretched for several seconds, filled with the unspoken words they had both been avoiding. "What is it, Gray?" she finally asked, her tone almost too casual. It was the same tone she used when discussing trivial things, plans for the weekend, the weather, even the grocery list. But tonight it felt wrong, like a mask she'd slipped on to hide something darker. Gray stood there for a moment, his mind racing, but his mouth dry. He'd been rehearsing this moment in his head for days, no, weeks. The questions, the suspicions, the heartbreak had all built up to this single confrontation. Yet when the moment finally arrived, all of it felt impossibly heavy, as though the weight of his feelings might crush him before he could even speak. He had tried to dismiss the signs, to brush off the changes in Kelly. He had told himself that work was stressful, that everyone goes through phases, that maybe he was just overthinking. But the pieces were falling into place now, and there was no denying it any longer. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. The words seemed to slip out before he could stop them. It wasn't a question about her lateness or her behavior. It was the question, the one that had been lurking in the back of his mind for months. "Why have you been acting like this?" Kelly didn't respond immediately. She turned slightly, glancing at him over her shoulder. Her eyes narrowed in a way that made Gray's stomach churn. "Acting like what?" she asked, the edge of her tone matching his. It was then that Gray noticed it. The way her gaze flicked to the side, the way her posture seemed to shift, like she was trying to shrink away from the confrontation without actually moving. There was something defensive in her stance, something closed off that hadn't been there before. "This isn't you," Gray continued, the words coming more freely now. "You used to tell me everything. We used to talk about everything. But now you come home late, you avoid me, and you're acting like I don't even exist half the time. I need to know what's going on, Kelly. I need to know if this is really what you want." He watched her carefully, waiting for her reaction. The tension in the room was thick, palpable, as if the very air around them had been charged with something neither of them could name. Kelly's lips parted, as if she were about to say something, but then she closed them again, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Gray wondered if she might walk away, avoid the confrontation altogether. But instead, she finally turned fully toward him, her face hardening into something unfamiliar. "You're being dramatic," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "I'm just living my life, Gray. You don't own me." The words hit him like a slap. For a moment, Gray couldn't speak. His breath caught in his throat as the reality of her response sank in. Was this really happening? Was this how she saw him now? The man who had shared her life, her dreams, the man who had once been her partner in everything? "I don't want to own you," Gray managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just want the woman I married back." There was a long, painful silence as Kelly stared at him, her face unreadable. She didn't move, didn't respond, and for a fleeting moment, Gray wondered if she had already made up her mind about everything, about them. But then, just as quickly, her expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "I'm tired, Gray," she muttered, her eyes lowering to the floor. "I'm just tired." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. It was the first crack in her mask, the first sign of vulnerability he had seen in weeks. Gray's heart twisted at the sight of her, and for a moment he wanted to reach out, to pull her into his arms and tell her that everything would be okay. But he knew that nothing would be okay until the truth was laid bare, no matter how much it hurt. Gray stood there, rooted to the spot, as Kelly's words lingered in the air between them. "I'm just tired," she had said, her voice barely a whisper. He could feel the weight of those words pressing down on him, yet something deeper within him stirred, a surge of clarity that had been building up for weeks. It wasn't anger that washed over him now, though it had been a constant companion for so long. It wasn't even fear, though his heart still raced with it. No, it was something stronger, something more enduring. It was resolve. For the first time in what felt like forever, Gray understood that the choice was no longer in Kelly's hands alone. He couldn't keep tiptoeing around the truth, hoping it would resolve itself, praying that things would magically go back to how they used to be. He had spent so many sleepless nights trying to convince himself that things would get better, that her distance was temporary, just another phase they would weather together. But now, as the weight of her silence hung between them, he realized that if he didn't act, they would both continue to drown in the growing distance, never reaching the shore. His gaze never left Kelly's face, though she had lowered her eyes, unable or unwilling to meet his. There was a sadness there, beneath the facade she had built, something raw that seemed to flicker in her eyes. Was it regret? Shame? Gray couldn't be sure, but it reminded him of something they once shared. Something that felt so distant now. He wanted to reach for it, to revive it. He wanted to believe that the woman standing before him, her back slightly hunched from exhaustion, was still the same person who had laughed with him late into the night about trivial things, who had held him close through every storm. But the reality of their situation was far clearer now. Kelly wasn't the same, and maybe neither was he. She had built walls around herself, and while Gray had stood by, hoping she would tear them down, it was becoming painfully obvious that only she could do that. But he couldn't wait for her to make the first move. He couldn't continue watching his marriage slip through his fingers while she remained a ghost of the woman he loved. "I don't want to fight, Kelly," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with a depth of emotion that threatened to break through. "But I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. It's not working anymore, is it?" Her silence was a sharp answer. She didn't speak, didn't even acknowledge him, and for a moment, Gray felt his heart tighten. But instead of retreating, instead of giving in to the fear of what might happen if he pushed further, he stood his ground. He had spent too long allowing her silence to be his guide, too long silencing his own voice for fear of pushing her away completely. Tonight, that changed. "I'm not saying I want to give up," he continued, the words coming with more certainty now. "But I can't keep doing this, Kelly. I can't keep pretending like everything is okay when every night you come home later, more distant, and I feel like I'm living with a stranger." He took a step closer, his eyes softening as he spoke. "I'm not asking you to have all the answers right now, but I need you to be honest with me about what's happening, about where we're headed." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Gray felt a shift. The distance between them had been palpable, a chasm that neither of them knew how to cross. But in that moment, standing there, resolute in his desire to save what was left of their marriage, it felt like a bridge was being built, not by words, but by action. He wasn't going to wait for her to make the first move. He was going to fight for them, even if it meant facing the hard truths. Kelly's gaze lifted slowly, meeting his eyes. There was a flicker of something in her expression, something he couldn't quite name. But before he could speak again, she shook her head. "I don't know if I can fix this," she whispered, the words so soft that Gray almost didn't catch them. But Gray wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "We don't have to fix it all tonight," he said gently, but with a quiet strength that surprised even him. "But we can start by being honest. We can start by not pretending anymore. This isn't just on you, Kelly. It's on both of us." He took a deep breath, a sense of finality settling over him. He had no idea where this conversation would lead or what the future held for their marriage. But for the first time in months, he felt like he was doing the right thing, like he was standing up for himself, for them. He wasn't just waiting for the storm to pass anymore. He was stepping into it, determined to face whatever it brought. Kelly looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. And in that silence, Gray felt the weight of the decision he had just made. The decision to fight for his marriage, to confront the truth, and to rebuild the connection they had lost, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. The silence between Gray and Kelly stretched on, thick and heavy, as the weight of his words settled in the room like a storm cloud. The air felt charged, almost electric, as they stood there. Two people who had once shared everything, now standing on the precipice of something they couldn't take back. Gray's heart beat loudly in his chest, each thud echoing in the hollow space between them. He had said it, the words that had been haunting him for so long, and now the truth hung in the air like a delicate thread, waiting to snap. Kelly's eyes darted to the floor, avoiding his gaze, but Gray wasn't about to let her slip away from him again. He couldn't. "I need to know, Kelly," he said softly, his voice tinged with a mixture of vulnerability and frustration. "Is there someone else?" The words came out in a breath, barely audible, but they carried the weight of everything he had been holding in for so long. It was the question that had been eating away at him, gnawing at his insides every time she came home late, every time she avoided his touch. And now, he couldn't pretend it wasn't there any longer. He had to know. The moment the question left his lips, Kelly flinched, her body tensing, as if the words had physically struck her. She took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the back of the chair by the door, clutching it for support. Gray saw it, the way her face paled, the slight tremble in her fingers. It was the kind of reaction he had been dreading, the kind of answer that confirmed what he had suspected but couldn't bring himself to face. "No, Gray," she said quietly, but there was a tremor in her voice, a hesitation that betrayed the lie. She looked up at him then, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. I haven't been unfaithful." But Gray wasn't fooled. He could see it now, the way her eyes shifted, the way her words didn't quite match the expression on her face. It was the first crack in her perfect facade, the first crack in the armor she had carefully constructed over the past few months. He had suspected something for weeks, but now, standing face to face with her, he realized that the truth was far worse than he had imagined. It wasn't just her actions that had changed. It was something deeper, something that went beyond a simple affair. "Then why?" Gray whispered, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Why have you been pulling away from me? Why have you been shutting me out, Kelly? Why does it feel like I'm losing you every single day?" Kelly's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak, didn't offer him any kind of explanation. Gray could see the struggle in her eyes, the conflict that raged within her. He knew, deep down, that whatever was happening, it wasn't just about another person. It was about something more insidious, something he hadn't been able to see until now. "You don't need to pretend anymore," he said, his voice low but firm, the tears threatening to spill from his own eyes. "I'm not asking for a perfect answer. I'm asking for the truth. I'm asking for us to stop living in this lie." For a long moment, Kelly didn't say anything. She just stood there, her hands trembling, her body rigid with something he couldn't quite place. But then slowly, her shoulders slumped and her gaze dropped to the floor. "I don't know how to explain it, Gray," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I felt so empty, for a while now, and I didn't know how to talk to you about it. You're not the problem, you never were. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself, and I didn't know how to come back." The rawness of her words hit Gray like a punch to the gut. He had suspected that there was something more to her distance, but hearing her admit it, the emptiness she felt, the loneliness that had consumed her, felt like a dagger to his heart. For all the pain he had been carrying, for all the anger and confusion, he realized that Kelly was just as lost as he was. She had been drowning in her own silence, and in her attempts to protect him from the truth, she had pushed him further away. "Kelly," Gray began, his voice shaking with emotion, but she held up a hand, stopping him before he could say more. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to destroy what we had, but I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to tell you that I was slowly slipping away from myself." Gray stood there, stunned, as the weight of her words settled over him. He had been so consumed with his own pain, so focused on the idea of betrayal, that he hadn't seen the hurt and confusion in Kelly's eyes. He had been so desperate to hold on to what they once had that he hadn't recognized how much she had been struggling, how much she had needed him, not just as a husband, but as a partner in life. The silence between them was deafening, but for the first time in months, it wasn't filled with tension. It was filled with a quiet understanding. They were both broken. both lost in their own way. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a chance for them to rebuild. Gray took a tentative step forward, his hand reaching out toward her, unsure if she would welcome the touch. But Kelly didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped into his embrace, her body trembling against his as the floodgates finally opened. The tears that had been held back for so long poured out of them both. Tears of regret, of longing, of sorrow. And in that moment, despite everything that had come before, Gray knew that this was the beginning of something new. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and it wasn't an easy fix, but it was the first step toward healing. The breaking point wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the hard work that lay ahead. But for the first time in a long while, Gray wasn't afraid of the future.